Okay, so welcome back to the ESTSS Future Leaders Talks on Psychotrauma, a podcast series by the European Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Future Leadership Group, or FLG. I am Dr. Justina Pociūnaitė-Ott, Assistant Professor at Lithuanian University of Health Sciences, and a member of the FLG. During these monthly podcast episodes, you'll have the opportunity to meet the different members of ESTSS's FLG who will take turns hosting the different podcast sessions. We'll discuss the latest advances, challenges, and future directions in understanding and addressing psychological trauma across Europe and beyond. So whether you're a clinician, researcher, student, policymaker, or program implementer, or just someone keen to learn more about psychotraumatology, we hope that you will enjoy this series. Today, I'm joined by Professor Talya Greene. Professor Talya Greene specializes in mental health consequences of exposure to traumatic events, combining psychological and public health expertise. Her work has provided important insights into the prevention treatment of PTSD following mass trauma. She has extensive experience advising community groups, faith leaders, health and social care workers, and policymakers on trauma-informed practice, mental health, and moral injury. Talya is head of the Trauma and Mental Health Research Group at University College London and has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters in the field of traumatic stress. Talya is an associate editor for the European Journal of Psychotraumatology. And her research pioneered the application of innovative data collection methods such as ecological monetary assessment combined with dynamic network analysis to provide insight into traumatic stress symptom dynamics. As part of the global collaboration on traumatic stress, she developed a toolkit for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, fair data. Welcome, Talya. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, as I was reading this introduction, and my excitement was just rising, and EMA and fair data and everything, you know, that we're so excited about. So, but before that, before we start talking about all the latest methods and research findings, and I would like to kick things off and love to start with a bit of behind the scenes question, if I may. So, what would you say, if you have one, is a special occupational hazard of your job, something you catch yourself doing because of your work, even outside of it?
Interesting. Well, I think because I'm very interested in mass trauma and kind of crisis-related situations, so things related to war, conflict, and disaster, I think I find that I look at everything through a kind of trauma lens. And unfortunately, the world is particularly unstable and kind of precarious at the moment. And so I think that I find it hard to separate my kind of professional self from my personal self. And I think that's probably something that a lot of trauma researchers and clinicians find, that they kind of experience the world through this kind of heightened understanding and awareness that trauma is there and will be impacting lots of people. So I think it's just really having this heightened sense of awareness of what people around the world are going through and what that must be like, and how might we want to think about helping them, and also understanding that we can't help everyone around the world. It's certainly not, you know, as an individual.
Yeah, indeed. Of course, that's you're right. It might be relevant for many of us or trauma researchers, but indeed, in this day and age, there's a lot of everything is happening. So of course, that's empathy, and it's a lot we start noticing. So thank you for sharing that. Indeed. So going, you know, because we want to talk a bit about research, but also a bit like a bit of advice for early career professionals. And we're always very interested, you know, when we see people that are professors and experts in the field of what first drew you into this study of traumatic stress. You know, what was that? Maybe there was some kind of a pivotal moment.
I don't know. I mean, there was definitely never a pivotal moment. I had a kind of unusual route, I guess, to this field. Because I did an undergraduate degree in psychology, which is not so unusual. But then I actually took a kind of sidestep, and for a while I thought I might be a historian of psychiatry. And I did a master's in the history and philosophy of science, medicine and technology, which I absolutely loved and thought was fascinating. But within that, I was always drawn to the kind of history of psychiatry and history of mental health in general, and the ways that people understand and respond to mental health problems across time. And I decided to do a PhD that was looking at kind of trauma and shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder, looking at it in Israel. And I was just really drawn to this kind of how we understand mental health shifts over time, and what does that mean, and how much these different understandings really impact on the kind of care that people receive. And I guess the stigma that they experience. And so all of that really drew me in. And I think maybe combined with a kind of awareness that my grandparents were all refugees from Europe to the UK or to Israel. And I think just really understanding, what does that mean, a kind of refugee experience, and what does it mean to have kind of traumatic grief and loss. And so I think probably it was the combination of something kind of personal drawing me in, and also just this, I don't know, just real interest in understanding that, you know, the way we conceive of things makes such a difference to the care people receive. And so it was originally kind of a historical look, but that very quickly shifted to towards a much more applied focus. I realized that actually I wasn't so interested in looking back at the past, and what I really wanted to do was impact the here and now. And so after I did that master's and that PhD, I really focused much more on trying to understand psychological stress now and trauma exposure now, and what might we want to do to kind of address things. So I did I don't know, you didn't ask me this, but I'll tell you anyway. So I did a couple of postdocs that looked at trauma and stress in military personnel and former prisoners of war and their family members. So I was kind of looking at these different groups that had been through military-related trauma. And while I was doing that, I really felt like I had a gap in my own knowledge and training. And so I decided to do another master's. I did a master's in public health in disaster and emergency management. And that way I kind of, I guess, completed or topped up a little bit of the applied research. So that it wasn't just kind of historical training, but also much more about how you manage things in the here and now, and kind of epidemiological skills as well. So that's why I kind of say I have this psychological and public health kind of expertise that I bring together.
Which of course is fulfilling each other so much. And, you know, I never even knew that there's such a thing as like history of like philosophy and history and all of that. Yeah. So yeah, that's something new. But I can also imagine that history is sometimes repeating itself, or something that we can definitely learn from a historical perspective, or, you know, maybe even not do the same mistakes that happened back then.
I mean, I think my biggest takeaway is that in every given moment, we feel like we're doing it right, and that this is the only way it could be, and everyone else got it wrong before us, but now we've cracked it. And it's just really, really clear if you look back through history that that's always the kind of overwhelming feeling. It's the paradigm that you're working in is kind of, it feels so obvious and obviously true. But I guess it's really given me a sense of thinking critically about what we do, and understanding, you know, what does it mean to talk about a construct? And it's kind of the most helpful tool we have available to us right now, but it doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean it's the only way. And the treatments we're using now may well develop, and we shouldn't be kind of too wedded to them. But should always be curious and always be open, and think about if there are alternative ways to conceptualize and alternative ways to treat, and go slowly, you know, kind of an evidence-based, careful advance. But I think just keeping that curiosity is really important.
Right. The curiosity and also that critical appraisal that you mentioned that I'm sure that people many years ago thought that we're doing the best. It wasn't like a malicious intent, right? To do.
Definitely not. And I think often when people kind of look back at history and they're so critical, how could we do this and how could we treat people like that? And I just think it's so clear there really wasn't malicious intent behind it, that people thought that they were doing the right thing and the best thing. And so bearing that in mind, I think, the really overwhelming majority of people in the field are just trying to do the right thing and what they think is the best thing. But if we can just keep our kind of critical skills about us, and awareness and humility, and just be aware that we are doing what we think is the best and the right thing based on the available evidence, but it doesn't mean it's the optimal approach, or at least it might be optimal for some and not for others. And just really trying to understand, is the person receiving the right and best care for them? I think that it helps you kind of keep those critical skills.
Exactly. So, but that's building on that about what's the latest and greatest right now and what's the emerging method and what we actually think is the best. And you did a lot of work on ecological momentary assessment, EMA, sometimes we call it ESM, and I'm a big fan of that method, right? So I'm extremely biased here, but
me too.
Luckily, yeah. But could you briefly explain what it is to our listeners and why it's important in trauma research?
So ecological momentary assessment or experience sampling method or daily diary study or intensive longitudinal assessment, there's all kinds of terms that aren't exactly the same, but kind of are capturing the same type of work, which is data collection methods that are repeatedly returning to an individual, usually over a kind of intensive period of time. So a short and repeated kind of method of data collection. So if you think about daily diaries where you're asking people once a day how they're feeling, that's kind of one version of this. But sometimes ecological momentary assessment or ESM can ask people like up to 10 times a day potentially how they're feeling and get their kind of self-reported experience in the moments through the course of the day in their real life as they go about, their kind of everyday experiences. And what we typically then get is, I don't know, anywhere between, let's say, 10 to, 200 kind of moments in time from an individual or a set of individuals. And you can use that to build a picture of what their daily life looks like, how symptoms and experiences play out in that daily life. Sometimes we'll see how symptoms trigger other symptoms. Sometimes we'll see how experiences in daily life are related to symptoms. It might be about interactions with other individuals. It might be about stressful moments. It might be about understanding the impact of an intervention. So you do before and after a particular intervention to see how things change. But it really gives a much more kind of accurate picture of their daily life. And really importantly, it allows us to understand something of the dynamics. So something about how these things fluctuate over the course of a day or over a week or over a month. And so you're not just getting a kind of static kind of snapshot of what happened at a moment in time. Because it might have been at that moment in time, they just happened to have an argument with their partner, and then we assess them, and then you get a very skewed kind of response, because we know that people have emotional responses and cognitive responses to, for example, an argument with your partner. But rather you get these kind of repeated snapshots, and you can really put them together to build almost like a video, like a moving, like a film version of, and much more 3D picture really of what's going on with them rather than just that moment in time. And for me, I think daily life is obviously crucial and central to everything that we're talking about. For me, it feels much closer to the way that clinicians work. Clinicians, when they work with a client, really will be trying to explore, what happens when you experience this and how does that make you feel, and does it trigger any other kind of feelings or responses or behaviors? And that's really the kind of theoretical or conceptual models that people bring with them to the clinic. And so I feel like this brings research closer to the clinic, and maybe is kind of more useful or more helpful. I mean, I don't think it's like EMA is better than other kinds of research. It's just better for a particular kind of research question. But for me, I just think it gives us really useful and helpful and clinically relevant insights.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing what it is and your take about why it is important. And indeed, we're definitely getting some, at least partly, very accurate results of what's going on in a person's daily life. And sometimes you think that, in any kind of research, we try to understand a person better. Any kind of psychological research, trauma research, we try to really understand what's going on in their life. And this EMA method is bringing this beautiful tool of answering those questions. And having done a lot of research, was there one from an EMA perspective, right, something that we could not find in cross-sectional data before and asking in the past 2 weeks or in the past month, but in really daily? Was there one result that was like mostly surprising to you, or like, now we found it?
I don't know if I'd say it quite like that. I find that with EMA, there's often, and like I'm really thinking about like many different EMA studies that we've run, like across maybe 20 different EMA studies that I've been involved in, that almost always you'll be surprised by the dynamic, by the temporal kind of ordering of things, and it just isn't working in daily life quite like we imagined it would, because ultimately, if the most of the understanding and knowledge in our field has been built on either cross-sectional studies or lab studies, which kind of don't reflect real life, or they are prospective studies, but they have these massive time gaps between them. So, for example, like you're measuring people every 3 months or every year or every 5 years. And I think that what I would say that I've really understood from EMA is that these are all completely different things. They're different phenomena and different time frames and working in different, like on different planes almost. And so the fact that, feeling depressed at time point 1 is associated with anxiety or PTSD at, 3 years later, doesn't mean that if you're feeling low in the morning, you'll have more PTSD symptoms in the afternoon. That they're just totally different things when you think about them in those ways. So, I suppose it's that, really, just being surprised that things don't work in the way that the theory thought it would, because the theory was built on these kind of different types of studies. Maybe an example I can give is one study that we did, which was using EMA during a period of kind of escalation, like conflict exposure. We were looking at negative emotions and PTSD symptoms according to the kind of DSM-5 clusters. And we assumed that kind of emotions are the foundational building blocks. And so you kind of start with negative emotions, and then that would kind of eventually lead to PTSD type symptoms, that they would kind of, the emotions would trigger the symptoms. But actually we found that for the most part it's the other way around, that the kind of clusters were triggering the negative emotions. And so I think just really thinking about what's kind of the independent and the dependent variable, and also really understanding that these things work in systems. And so actually the kind of traditional concept of you have something at time 1 and that triggers something else at time 2, it's not really the way it works in real life, that these things are all kind of, these symptoms and experiences are all working together in a dynamic system. And sometimes some are dominant, sometimes others are dominant, and sometimes they all come together. And, and some of them, the time frame is like literally seconds, and some of them it's hours, and some of them it's years. And so just trying to map out the system is really complex. And I think EMA has kind of helped me to understand that a bit more.
Right. I think I will definitely say that for myself later when I need to, make sense about, so how do we make sense of EMA in comparison to cross-sectional or all the other findings is because we always try to, so if we find it here, we just need to confirm it right now in a daily life. But it's not the right question, right?
Yeah.
Not the right question to ask. So thank you for sharing that. It's very, very useful and inspiring for us to know that there's just different processes happening on different timescales.
Yeah. And I think when I speak with people who are doing EMA research for the first time, I really try and really push them to think about real individuals and what like a real individual, actual, authentic, everyday life experience might look like. You know, thinking a bit clinically, if that's relevant to the research question. I'm not a clinician, but I think, like I said, the EMA lends itself to kind of a clinical way of thinking about things. And so just to really think about what does it really look like for people in their daily life, and make sure that the research questions align and the EMA is the right approach. Because I think lots of people do EMA because they can, but I think it, you know, but should we is about the research question.
Right. And it is a very resource heavy method for collecting data and for participants to participate in that research. So I, you know, for instance, ethics boards, I get a lot of questions. Isn't that too much for participants? I know the answer, but maybe you can share it with our listeners as well. What would be the answer?
Yeah, I think again, it's just about, is this a question that we can only answer in this way? And is it an important question? And I actually have found, and I don't know if you found this as well, but for the most part, we've had really high compliance with our EMA studies. And that includes those where we compensated or incentivized quite heavily, but also those where there was like no incentive. So long as the research kind of questions, the items that they're answering feel really, really relevant to the population that are completing the study. We found that when they just feel like, yes, this is capturing something that is really part of my daily experience and people don't know it. And if I do this, it just, you know, reflects my life. Then we found that people are very, like, just really high compliance, much more than you'd expect.
Right. It's more about reflecting people's life and back to asking the right question and being respectful, right, to participants' time, indeed. Yeah. And now speaking about the resources that it might take, right? There's this other wonderful movement, I even call it, fair data. So you're a strong advocate for fair data, and I'm actually really curious and to see what motivated you to become part of this. Maybe movement is not the right term, but I feel like, you know, I'm part of a community, and why it matters to us as researchers to be fair.
I think for me, there's a couple of things that are kind of underpinning it. See if I can remember them as I'm speaking. But the first is that I think that research is very research in the trauma field is demanding of its participants. You know, by definition, they would have gone through something difficult, and then we're kind of coming in to ask them questions about it. And I think that we need to just be really respectful of the contribution that they've made. And if there are data sets out there that can help us answer questions, and we don't need to ask people either again, who've already been asked, or alternatively asking whole new groups of people questions, you know, but we can actually answer these things we really want answered with existing resources, then I feel like there's a moral imperative to kind of use that already. And the other thing is, I think that actually, so it's a kind of an ethical and moral imperative. Right. The other thing is that actually it can be, sometimes with traumas, especially with a mass trauma event, let's say there was, you know, a terrible fire in a school, as an example, you actually can identify all of those individuals. You know, kind of reasonably easily, it would be clear who's participated in the research. You know, if you've got 100 people affected and you've interviewed or conducted research with those 100 people, then even if you can't identify the individual kind of data point for that individual. It's really clear that you're talking about them and their community. And I think that we should try and minimize these kinds of things. I think it's not the same as other kinds of research where it's not anchored to particular events. But I think if it is anchored to particular events, then I feel like we ought to be respectful of people's kind of privacy. And if we can avoid it, let's not collect new data just for the sake of it. I think there is a kind of tendency that every time, as trauma researchers, certainly I include myself in this, but when something big happens, everyone wants to run off and collect data. I think that's natural. That's what we do. Maybe we don't need to. Maybe we could answer these questions by reusing data sets that exist. Sometimes the data sets are small as well. And so we've got, 20 people who've been through a terrible event, and somebody else has got another, data from another 50 people, and somebody else has got data from another 30 people. Maybe we can combine these data and actually say something a bit more kind of robust about these responses. I just think there's a kind of imperative, reduce the burden on individuals, use the, once we've collected that data, reuse it to answer new questions rather than rushing out and collecting more data. It almost feels, like we're kind of just trying to minimize resources, like use and consumption in the world. And these are people, and we're kind of, let's just not overly burden people if it's not needed. Or combine data sets to ask new questions, which involves a kind of reuse and harmonization process.
Right. So it's really about using the resources wisely and seeing do you really need that new data set. And I think thank you for sharing that, because again, it's inspiring, right, to hear from you, because it's a very slow process, I think. And you're being a big part of moving that process into trauma researchers being more aware of what's happening. How can we be using what's already available?
I think there's been like a real, the field has been quite territorial up until now. And I think that it really is shifting, that people want to work together, they want to work globally. There's kind of more scope for collaboration. But I think ultimately, if you've set out to answer a particular question, the people have come and asked me for, to reuse my data. They've asked questions I would never in a million years have even thought of, to just, often lots of kind of statistical stuff that's, about measurement and refining measurement. And it's just not what that's not what I set out to do. I set out to answer a substantive question. But if you can use the data set to refine methods, that's brilliant, So I think we just don't know all the questions. Like, the questions are infinite, and
right.
And if somebody else has got a good question, then yes, please do use my data set to answer that really good question that I'd never thought about.
Right, because as a young researcher, when I was going or master's or PhD, I'm thinking, well, I always have to collect my own data, and this is how I'm useful to the field. But then the more I got to meet experts in the field, people that have been in that area for a long time, it's just the other way around. Just please use what's available so far, and exactly meeting and talking about FAIR is part of that.
I think these are really useful skills for young researchers to both collect data themselves, to just understand the process of data collection, but also to learn how to work with existing data sets and resources. And I think harmonizing or, combining data sets gives you such an insight into the things you need to think about when you conduct research to make it transparent. And I don't know how all the decisions along the way that felt obvious, actually, when you work with somebody else to try and combine a data set, and you were like, oh, I could have definitely done this differently. I could have labeled this differently. I could, I didn't think about the fact that if I asked them how they felt over the last day, that's not the same as over the last hour. And now, can we combine it or can we not combine it? And if I just said right now, how are you feeling right now, then we could have combined it. And, just all these questions about how you conduct research in the best possible way will become clearer when you're starting to think about sharing your data sets.
Exactly. So thinking many steps ahead by working with what's already available.
Yeah.
And that's actually very much related to my other question that I had about, looking back about that moment of I know something now, but what would I have done differently? So is there something that you wish you had known when you were an early career researcher or professional, not only about data, right, but in general? That's
I think if I was doing it again, I just would have tried not to say yes to every opportunity that came my way. I think as a young researcher, everything is exciting. Everything is, that could be a potential new avenue for me. I will learn new skills. I will work with new people. This is a really important project. In trauma research, everything is important. And so it's very hard to say no to something because it's also important. I think actually there is something about not spreading yourself too thin at the beginning, developing some kind of more in-depth skills, going a little bit more slowly. I wish I had done a little bit of that. I've spread so thin, and I just think that's probably quite a common experience amongst early career researchers, as they say yes to everything, then they've got no time for anything, and there's something about work-life balance that you need to learn. How to kind of retain that in life. And so I think it's just about maybe saying yes to just one or two fewer things, just, and learning to say no a little bit to really develop like your core skills and niche area, and not just kind of doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm grinning from ear to ear because I'm so guilty of that.
Yeah, everybody is, because it's all exciting and interesting. Yeah. I think nobody becomes a researcher if it's not passionate, or they certainly don't stay being a researcher unless they're really passionate about it. But yeah, just being a little bit more discerning, saying no a couple more times is probably a good idea.
Right. Thank you for that. And as we're coming to the end of our conversation, unfortunately, I'd love to ask, we talked about the historical perspective, we talked about what's happening right now, what is changing now with fair data, with new methods. And what do you think do you think there's something in the field of trauma, in your specific field, that deserves more attention right now and perhaps is heading that way?
That's a good question. I think there's lots of things that we need to think about, but I do really think about the fact that so many people in the world are exposed to trauma, and the opportunity for them to have the kind of classic one-to-one, 12 sessions of CBT, it's almost zero for the vast majority of the people in the world who've been exposed to trauma. And so I think we really need to think about how can we translate the theoretical and clinical knowledge that we've, kind of developed over some decades now, around PTSD and around the impact of trauma, and how do we translate that into something that is helpful for people who aren't going to be able to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist? What kinds of models of prevention can we think about? What kinds of models of intervention can we think about that are delivered either, kind of task shifting and delivered by non-mental health professionals, but by, trusted people in the community? What training can we give? How can we upscale that and increase access to it? What do we need to do differently, basically, so that more people get appropriate support? And really refining those models, because I think there is still a sense that, gold standard is, you get treatment from a psychologist. And that might be true, but it might also not be true. And so let's just, like I said, stay open and curious and think about other ways of doing things. Let's think about group models. Let's think about intensive models. Let's think about the promise of digital tools and, interventions and that could come, via a smartphone, for example. So yeah, I think it's just really about recognizing that we've really developed some good interventions, but most of them are not applicable in the real world for so many populations. So what else can we do?
Right. Thank you for sharing this, because essentially the idea is to help as many people as possible to receive the care that they need. So indeed, it's just very inspiring to have, for us to think where else we're going. Maybe with all those yes that we're saying to as a young professionals, we can find this as a project. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Talya. This was a very insightful. The pleasure is all ours, and this was a really insightful conversation. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to the ESTSS Future Leaders Talks on Psychotrauma. Be sure to join us again next time for more conversations on psychotrauma.
Thank you.